Howdy folks, and welcome to Campfire Stories, where I'll tell you a story that's terrifying, bewildering, or amazing, and it's up to you to decide in the comments whether the story you just heard was real or not. At the conclusion of this story, of course, I'll always tell you what I think based on my research. Anyways, if you like hearing about strange lore, learning about local oddities, and hearing supposed stories of the supernatural, you've come to the right place, because that's what Storytime is all about. These videos will always be free, and all I ask from you is that if you decide you like the video, just like it, and subscribe if you're not already. This will go a long way towards helping the channel, and I'll be forever appreciative. With that, let's get into today's story. What stalked us while we went fishing? So before we get started telling the story from one of my viewers, I just want to set the scene for you. This story takes place near a place called the Kingston Steam Plant, a notable landmark in eastern Tennessee, in the sense that as locals drive over the Clinch River on their way to and from Knoxville, they'll often see the tall stacks of this coal-fired power plant spewing out smoke as it generates electricity for the area. This area is an unusual spot for a story about a creature in the woods, in a way, because, frankly, as eastern Tennessee goes, it's a pretty busy place. The local population might not necessarily be gigantic, sitting at just around 6,000 people, but the area near this plant has plenty of residential neighborhoods, and, as I said, Interstate 40 runs by, meaning there's quite a bit of noise even in the middle of the night. The writers of the story didn't say exactly where around this plant they were, but considering they mention they're fishing, I'd guess they were right along the Clinch River. And later in the story, you'll hear they make a break for their cars across I-40, so I'd guess they're somewhere in the area on our screen right now. Anyways, sit back, relax, and grab yourself a blanket because we're going to tell a campfire story. It was the summer of 1996, and the heat was oppressive, as it always is in eastern Tennessee in the summer. The air hung thick, clinging to your skin like a damp cloth. My best friend Luke and I had been fishing in this area near the Kingston Steam Plant since we were kids. We knew these woods like the back of our hands, and nothing strange had ever happened to us here until this morning. It was early, too early, but the sun was already rising over the nearby hills, the younger siblings to the Smokies, casting an orange glow over the winding trails leading down to the lake. I was late, like usual. I'd rushed out of the house, pulling on my boots and grabbing my tackle box without a second thought. I knew Luke would be waiting for me. He was always the first one to get there. I walked down the familiar path, the crunch of gravel beneath my feet the only sound in the early morning stillness. When I got to the lake, the sight of Luke's gear caught me off guard. His rods and tackle box were there, neatly placed on the shore, but he wasn't. I figured he'd just wandered off into the woods, maybe to take care of business, maybe to find a better spot. It wasn't unusual for him to disappear for a few minutes. But as I stood there staring out at the calm waters, something felt off. Minutes passed, and I couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine. The birds were still quiet. The morning should have felt peaceful, but there was a sense of stillness, a sense of waiting, like the entire forest was holding its breath. After what felt like an eternity, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, expecting to see Luke, but there was only the sound of dry leaves crunching underfoot. But then, thankfully out of the trees, he appeared. Luke came walking down the trail, looking a little confused, but otherwise fine. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice full of surprise. I was baffled. "What do you mean? I've been standing here waiting for you." But he just stared at me, eyes wide. "I thought you were already here," he replied, looking over his shoulder nervously. "I heard someone behind me making noise in the woods. I thought it was you. I even followed whoever it was for a bit, but they didn't stop. I never got close enough to see who or what it was." I was dumbfounded. "That wasn't me, Luke. I've been standing here this whole time." We both stood there for a moment, the air suddenly feeling colder, heavier. Something wasn't right. "Are you sure it wasn't a deer or something?" I asked, trying to brush it off, but Luke shook his head. "I know what a deer sounds like. This was different. It was too heavy, too deliberate, like someone or something was walking right behind me." I didn't say anything, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The idea that something or someone had been walking around in the woods behind us without us hearing it approach, it made my skin crawl. It didn't make sense. We decided to keep fishing. The morning wore on, the stillness broken only by the sounds of our lines splashing into the water. But then something else happened, something that made the blood in my veins turn to ice. We heard it, movement behind us. At first it was faint, A rustling, maybe the sounds of a breeze pushing through the trees or a squirrel darting through the underbrush, but it didn't stop. It was heavy, too heavy for a squirrel. The sound was coming from behind the ridge, just beyond our sight. I looked at Luke. He was staring straight ahead, eyes wide. We both froze. The noise was still there, a slow, steady thud, 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 like something large was walking right behind us, just out of sight. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Luke would nod, his face pale. "What the hell is that?" he whispered back. The sound came closer, and my pulse quickened. Whatever it was moving in our direction, and it wasn't trying to be quiet. The footsteps were deliberate, heavy, like something much bigger than a man. I wanted to call out, to shout, to say something, but I couldn't. The fear in my chest was thick, suffocating. Then, in an instant, the noise stopped. Complete silence. The forest seemed to breathe again, but it felt wrong. It was too quiet. We tried to brush it off as nothing, probably a bear, maybe a deer, but neither of us believed it. I had fished in these woods my whole life, and I had never encountered anything like this. Thoroughly creeped out, we figured we'd stop fishing for now, and that we'd go home, grab some lunch, and reconvene later in the evening. We thought to ourselves, of course, that this was all just our minds playing a trick on us, or possibly the typical animals of the forest being a bit more restless than usual. Regardless, though, the unease stayed with us, even as we relaxed during the middle of the day, and I personally found myself dreading going back out that evening. That being said, when you're young and dumb, it's better to face your fears and play tough than let your friends know you're a wimp. So I swallowed my apprehension, and right at sunset, we showed back up at the same spot for some night fishing. The air was thick with humidity, and the darkness swallowed the whole forest. The moon barely illuminated the path, and the trees loomed over us as silent sentinels. We reached the bottom of the trail again and set up just like before. The water looked different in the dim light, the surface smooth as glass, barely rippling. Time passed, but the eerie feeling never left. As we fished, these same noises began. At first it was faint, like before, a crack of twigs in the distance, a rustle in the brush, but then it grew louder, closer. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but the movement was unmistakable. Something was behind us. It wasn't just a casual sound either, it was deliberate. Whatever it was stalking us. 1 minute it sounded like it was 15 yards behind us, and then no more than a minute later it was at the top of the ridge, as if it had covered that distance in seconds. I looked at Luke. His face was still pale, his eyes were still wide, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Something was not right. "What the hell is that?" I whispered to Luke. And before Luke could answer, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A shape, large and dark, moving quickly among the trees. It was just a shadow, but it was enough to make my blood run cold once again. I grabbed my gear, adrenaline coursing through my veins, and we bolted. We didn't care about the fish anymore, we just needed to get out of Dodge. As we rushed back up the path, we were nearly at the clearing when I caught a flash of movement to the side. I didn't have the time to process what it was, but it was something large, something heavy, that came crashing through the trees, landing just to the side of us. I caught only a glimpse. I thought maybe it was a log, maybe something else, but it was massive whatever it was, and it landed with a force that shook the ground beneath our feet. We didn't stop to look, we kept running. As we sprinted up the path, I could feel the hairs on my neck standing straight up. We didn't even care about anything but getting out of there, and we didn't even look at the road when we ran across I-40. I could have sworn we were being followed, but I didn't dare turn around. When we finally made it to safety, both of us were shaken. Our breaths came in short, panicked bursts, and our minds were racing. We talked about it for days afterwards, trying to make sense of what happened, but we never really came up with an explanation that made sense. It was like a dream or a nightmare, but I know it wasn't. Something was out there in those woods, something big, something that wasn't human, something that could throw a log at people. I don't know if we encountered Bigfoot that night, but I'm not sure what else it could have been. Whatever it was, I'll never forget the feeling of being watched by something that was out there, just beyond the trees. Now I should note, I've been back to those woods since, but I haven't heard a thing. I can't say I'm disappointed. Whatever it was that followed us, whatever it was that threw that log, I hope it stays hidden, because sometimes some things are better left unexplained. Howdy folks, it's T here, back as myself now. So what do you think our Ryder and Luke saw? I'd love to hear your opinions below. As for myself, well, I've spent a lot of time in the woods of eastern Tennessee. I've hiked nearly every inch of the Appalachian Trail in Tennessee and in North Carolina, and I've camped for nearly 3 whole months of my life in the Cherokee National Forest, and I've spent more time in Imes Nature Area than I'd ever tell my folks. Yes, Dad, that's probably why I got a C+ in chemical reactor fundamentals. Regardless, what I'm getting at is when you spend a lot of time in the woods, you get a strong opinion about what lives in them. Personally, I've experienced similar things to these two from time to time, but in my case, I usually never had it revealed to me what exactly was making these noises. And when it was revealed, this sort of thing was almost always a sign of a wild boar being nearby, so I guess my quote-unquote reasonable hat says maybe these two ran into a wild boar, and while they made their escape, they saw a person up on the ridge. Otherwise, man, I really only know of one thing that's shaped like a man, but really, really big, and I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. The old Sasquatch, Bigfoot, or as I called him in my last video, Old Size 19. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed hearing this story, and quick reminder, if you have a compelling story, I'm hoping to share more like this every week or two, and I'm looking for stories that are located somewhere that you can find in real life, that share some verifiable details, or that touch on well-known or even forgotten urban legends. If you've got one like this, a Sasquatch story, a story of a run-in with a dangerous but very real creature, or possibly even a run-in with a ghost, you know I'd love to hear it. Also, as usual, if you want to see more like this, a like and your subscription are always appreciated, and it'll help make sure my videos show up in your feed in the future. Anyways, most importantly, even if you're out fishing right now and you just know something is watching you, stalking you, and waiting to make you their prey, don't you ever forget, it's always story time.